My first car was a dark green 1964 Volkswagen convertible. With only 36 horsepower, how was it this car was so much fun to drive? Was it because of the influence of the designer of one of today's most popular sports cars? Do you have an idea who the designer was? Hello, I'm your host, Gary Neidert, and you're listening to My First Ride podcast. Lately, I've been talking about different cars with air-cooled engines. I mean, what a deal. As I've said in previous episodes, not having to mess with coolant and radiators. You don't have to worry about busted radiator hoses. You don't have to worry about a busted radiator. You don't have to worry about a thermostat going bad and causing the motor to overheat. You don't have to worry about the coolant not protecting the engine below 30 degrees. All those kinds of things. So with an air-cooled engine, you don't have to worry about that. However, with an air-cooled engine, as I found out with my Volkswagen, not much of a heater. Well, let's move on. It all started in the mid-1930s when Dr. Ferdinand Porsche of the Porsche 911 fame and a soon-to-be crazed leader of Germany, Adolf Hitler, developed a car for the common guy, the Volkswagen, or the Volkswagen, or with a little bit of German accent on it. Let's see if I can get this right. The Volkswagen. From the very beginning, the Volkswagen was air-cooled until the last Volkswagen rear-engine Beetle rolled off the assembly line in Mexico. The history of Volkswagen is very dear to my heart because of my first ride, as I said before, a 1964 convertible. Doing the research on this one revealed much that I never knew about the history of Volkswagen. This one's going to be especially exciting for me to talk about, and I know you're going to enjoy the story. So let's just get right on into it. So I'm going to talk about some information that I found on Haggerty.com that's specific to the 1964 Volkswagen Beetle. Subtle changes took place in the 1964 Volkswagen Beetle when the new models were introduced in August of 1963. Really big visible changes were still a year away. Beetle sales worldwide climbed to over 1 million units. More than 6 of every 10 imported cars sold in the country were now Volkswagens. VW estimated 1.6 million of their Beetles, Transporters, and Karmann Ghia models were running on the U.S. highways. Now let's talk about the value. If you have a 1964 Volkswagen, if you have one, it's called Condition 1. These vehicles are the best in the world. The visual image is of the best vehicle in the right colors, driving onto the lawn at the finest concourse. Perfectly clean, the vehicle has been groomed down to the tire treads. Painted and chrome surfaces are mirror-like. Dust and dirt are banned and materials used are correct and superbly fitted. The one-word description for the number one vehicle is concourse. And what's the value estimated of a concourse 1964 Volkswagen today? Around $47,600. Imagine that. I bought mine for $500 in 1971, I think it was. Even new, that car was $2,000. And I wished I had it back today. The number 2 is excellent condition. That one's $28,800. Number 3 is good, $13,400. And number 4, which would be fair condition, $6,400. So that kind of gives you an idea of what they're worth today. I'd love to have mine back, but it would take a lot of money to get it back up to where I think it would be in good drivable condition. Now, the rest of this information I'm going to talk about comes from Wikipedia. And I want to touch on what Wikipedia says about the convertible, or they call it the cabriolet. In 1948, Wilhelm Karmann, you remember the Karmann Ghia? Well, that's the Karmann of Karmann Ghia. He bought a Volkswagen Beetle sedan and converted it into a 4-seater convertible. After successfully presenting it at Volkswagen in Wolfsburg, the Beetle Cabriolet began production in 1949 by Karmann in Osnabrück. The convertible was more than a Beetle with a folding top. To compensate for the strength lost in removing the roof, the sills were reinforced with welded U-channel rails. A transverse beam was fitted below the front edge of the rear seat cushion, and the side cowl panels below the instrument panel were double-walled. In addition, the lower corners of the door apertures had welded-in curved gussets, and the doors had secondary alignment wedges at the B-pillar. The convertible was generally more lavishly equipped than the sedan. Would get this. This is what makes it more lavishly equipped. Dual rear ashtrays, twin map pockets, a visor vanity mirror on the passenger side, rear stone shields, and through 1969, wheel trim rings. How about that? Lavishly equipped. Many of these items did not become available on other Beetles until the advent of the optional L, or the Luxus package, of 1970. After a number of stylistic and technical alterations made to the Karmann Cabriolet, or the convertible, the last of 331,847 cabriolets came off the production line on January 10 of 1980. I'm just glad I got to own one of those, one of the 331,000, almost 332,000 convertibles. It was a lot of fun. Now let's talk about kind of the history of the Beetle itself. The Volkswagen Beetle, officially the Volkswagen Type 1. Informally in Germany, it was called the Käfer, something like that. Sorry about the mispronunciation in German, but it meant Beetle. I mean, that's where the Beetle originated from, was where they talked about it in Germany. It was a 2-door rear engine economy car intended for 5 occupants. Now, in some countries, however, Beetles were restricted to 4 people. It was manufactured and marketed by German automaker Volkswagen from 1938 until 2003. Its concept and functional objectives were formulated by the leader of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler. He wanted a cheap, simple car to be mass-produced for his country's new road network, the Reichsautobahn. Lead engineer Ferdinand Porsche and his team took until 1938 to finalize the design. Bella Barini, whatever. Some of these names I can't pronounce. Is credited with first conceiving the original design for this car in 1925, notably by Mercedes-Benz, 5 years before Porsche claimed to have done his initial version. The influence of Porsche's design of other contemporary cars such as the Tatra V570 and the work of Joseph Ganz remained a subject of dispute. Here's our controversy for this car. Just a quick note about the Tatra the V570. It was a prototype developed in the early 30s by a team led by Hans Ledwinka and Paul Jarret. The aim of the construction team was to develop a cheap people's car with an aerodynamic body. However, the company's management decided that the revolutionary ideas introduced in the prototypes should be introduced in large, luxurious cars, and therefore the team abandoned the project of small cars in favor of the Tatra T77, the world's first serially produced aerodynamic car. The project of a small car was later continued and led to the introduction of the Tatra T97. Now, the second V570 was built in 1933, a few years before the first Volkswagen, and which the Volkswagen bears a strong resemblance to the Tatra. In the opinion of Tatra, the Volkswagen was misappropriated by Adolf Hitler and Dr. Ferdinand Porsche in circumstances which the German company remains intensely sensitive. Ultimately, the result of Ferdinand Porsche's design influence was the first Volkswagen and one of the first rear-engine cars since the brass era. With almost 22 million vehicles produced, the Beetle is the longest-running and most manufactured car of a single platform ever made. Although designed in the 1930s, due to World War II, civilian Beetles only began to be produced in significant numbers by the end of the 1940s. The car was then internally designated the Volkswagen Type 1 and marketed simply as the Volkswagen. Later models were designated Volkswagen 1200, 1300, 1500, 1302, or 1303. The original 25 horsepower Beetle was designed for a top speed of around 62 miles an hour, which would be a viable cruising speed on the Reichsautobahn system. So does viable cruising speed mean that is you can cruise at the top speed of the car, just cruise there flat out, wide open? I don't know. I've wondered that as I've been looking through all this stuff. As Autobahn speeds increased in the post-war years, its output was boosted to 36, then 40 horsepower. This configuration lasted through 1966 and became the classic Volkswagen motor. The Beetle marked a significant trend led by Volkswagen and then by Fiat and Renault. Sales of the rear-engine, rear-wheel drive layout increased from 2.6%, or less than 3 out of every 100 Volkswagens or rear-engine cars produced of continental Western Europe's car production in 1946 to 26.6%, or almost 27 of every 100 vehicles produced with a rear-engine vehicle in 1956. It gained a lot of traction during that time. A lot of people liked it. In 1959, even General Motors launched an air-cooled rear-engine car, the Chevrolet Corvair, which even shared the Beetle's flat engine and swing axle architecture. So I talked about this in my First Ride podcast, episode number 8, air-cooled engines, the Chevy Corvair. Go back, if you haven't watched or listened to it, go back and check that out. Over time, front-wheel drive and frequently hatchback-bodied cars would come to dominate the European small car market. In 1974, Volkswagen's own front-wheel drive Golf hatchback succeeded the Beetle. In 1994, Volkswagen unveiled the Concept One, which was a retro-themed concept car with a resemblance to the original Beetle, and in 1998 introduced the new Beetle, built on the contemporary Golf platform with styling recalling the original Type 1. It remained in production through 2010 and was succeeded in 2011 by the Beetle A5. It was just an updated version of the front engine Beetle that started production. And production ceased altogether by 2019. In the 1999 Car of the Century competition, to determine the world's most influential car in the 20th century, the Type 1 came in fourth after the Ford Model T, the Mini, and the Citroën DS. The Volkswagen was designed to be as simple as possible mechanically. It started off with an air-cooled 25 horsepower, 995 cc motor. It had a built-in oil cooler, and with the flat 4-engine configuration, it made for superior performance in the desert heat. The suspension design used compact torsion bars instead of coil or leaf springs. The Beetle is nearly airtight and will briefly float if you want to do so. I don't know why anybody would do that anyway, but it can float for a little while. Though extremely successful in the 1960s, experiencing its greatest sales growth in North America between 1960 and 1965, the Beetle was increasingly faced with stiff competition from more modern designs globally. During the late 1960s, the Japanese Big Three would soon dominate the compact auto sales in North America. In 1971, Ford introduced its Pinto, the car named after a bean. No, not really. It was named after a horse. But it's an odd name, a Pinto. It makes you think of a pinto bean. Anyway, and all this had market impact as a low-cost alternative in the wake of the drop of the U.S. dollar against the Deutschmark that same year. As the 1960s came to a close, Volkswagen faced increasingly stiff competition from European cars as well. Volkswagen's attempts to boost the power of their air-cooled motor to meet the demands of higher highway speeds in the late 60s, plus having to comply with new pollution control regulations, caused problems for reliability and fuel efficiency. The result? It impaired the reputation of the aging design. Safety issues with the Beetle came under increasing scrutiny, culminating in the 1972 release of a rather scathing report, which was done by Ralph Nader, Unsafe at Any Speed, which pretty much killed the Corvair. During the early 1970s, sales of the Beetle in Europe and North America plummeted. On February 17, 1972, Beetle number 15,007,034 was produced, surpassing total production of the previous record holder, the Model T. By 1973, total production was over 16 million, and by June 23, 1992, over 21 million VWs had been produced. Production lines at Wolfsburg switched to a new water-cooled front-engine, front-wheel drive Golf in 1974. It was sold in North America at the time as the Rabbit. I don't know if you remember that. It was kind of a squared-off car. The Golf eventually became Volkswagen's most successful model since the Beetle. It was periodically designed over its lifetime with only a few components carried over between generations, entering its 8th generation in 2019. The Beetle had only minor refinements of its original design. The Golf did not kill the Beetle. However, production of the Beetle continued in smaller numbers at other German factories until January 19, 1978, when mainstream production shifted to Brazil and Mexico, markets where low operating cost was an important factor. After this shift in production, sales in Europe did not stop, but became very low. Beetle sedans were produced for U.S. markets until July of 1977 and for European markets until 1985. The Beetle outlasted most other cars which had adopted the rear-engine air-cooled layout, such as those by Subaru, Fiat, and General Motors. Porsche's 356 series, which originally used some Volkswagen-sourced parts, continued to use the classic rear-engine layout in the Porsche 911 996 series. However, the 911 later became water-cooled, and I talked about that in another episode of my First Ride podcast. By 2002, over 21 million Type 1s had been produced, but by 2003, annual production had dropped to 30,000 from a peak of 1.3 million in 1971. That's a lot of cars in 1 year. VW announced the end of production in June of 2003, citing decreasing demand, and the final original Type 1 Volkswagen Beetle, number 21,529,464, rolled off the production line at Puebla, Mexico on July 30th, 2003, 65 years after its original launch. Hey, it could have qualified for Medicare. How about that? This last Beetle, nicknamed El Rey, Spanish for the King, after a legendary Mexican song by Jose Alfredo Jimenez, was delivered to the company's museum in Wolfsburg, Germany. The final batch of Beetles were sold as 2004 models. To celebrate the occasion, Volkswagen marketed a final special series of 3,000 Beetles marked as Ultima Edition, Final Edition, in Aquarius Blue or Harvest Moon Beige. Each car included the 1.6-liter engine, white wall tires, a CD player with 4 speakers, chrome bumpers, trim, hubcaps, and exterior mirrors, a Wolfsburg emblem above the front trunk's handle, an all-cloth interior, chrome glove box badge, body-colored wheels, tinted glass, a rear partial shelf, and a VW Ultima Edition plaque. The specs for the final Volkswagen produced: the engine was fuel-injected, 4-cylinder, horizontally opposed, air-cooled, with a displacement of 1,584 cc's and 50 horsepower. The rated fuel mileage in the U.S. was 32.5 miles per gallon. Maximum cruising speed was 81 miles an hour. So you get to cruise 81 miles an hour, which is as fast as the car would go. You get to cruise that. You cruise it wide open. I don't know. Front brakes, front disc brakes, rear drum, 5-passenger, 11 gallons of gas in the U.S. And as I said, Aquarius Blue, Harvest Moon Beige were the color options. In Mexico, there was an advertising campaign as a goodbye for the Beetle. In one of the ads, a very small parking space on the street was shown, and many cars tried to use it but could not. After a while, a sign appears in that parking space saying, "It is incredible that a car so small can leave such a large void." Another depicted the rear end of a 1954 Beetle, the year Volkswagen was established in Mexico, in the left side of the ad, reading "Once Upon a Time." And on the last 2003 Beetle in the right side, reading "The End." Other ads also had the same nostalgic tone. The Beetle was prized for its seemingly unchanged appearance. Quote, "We do not believe in planned obsolescence. We don't change a car for the sake of change." End quote. While the overall appearance of the Beetle changed little over its lifespan, it received over 78,000 incremental changes during its production. So there you have it. That's a very, very brief description of the Volkswagen Beetle, the convertible, the 1964 Volkswagen. And make sure that you go to Wikipedia to read all the information, because there's some pretty cool stuff in there. I'm going to include the link for Wikipedia in the show notes. Plus, I'm going to include a link where you could go to some YouTube videos. I've got like 3 I want to post that talk about one of them is the commercial where it shows the parking space of the Beetle. And these are all in Spanish. Or 2 of them are in Spanish, one of them's in English. But it shows that parking space that just the Beetle fit in. So they're really good commercials. So I encourage you to go watch those. So I've had a great time talking about this, and I hope you've enjoyed listening to this episode. Again, there's so much more that I could talk about on the Volkswagen Beetle, about its production and all the accessories, the things that were changed and all that kind of stuff. So just go look at Wikipedia so you can find out. So what's coming up next on My First Ride? Well, as I've said in the past, and I'll continue to say it, I'm constantly searching for people that would enjoy telling the stories of their first rides and how their lives were influenced by them. And I bet you probably know someone that would be a great guest for My First Ride podcast, right? Well, let me know a little bit about them and their story. What about you telling your story on the podcast? Let me know a little bit about you and your first ride. Check us out and subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and more. And of course, you can always go to the website at myfirstridepodcast.com. One final thought. You may not have your first ride, but you still have the memories. It's time to share them. Contact me if you have any questions regarding today's podcast, or you'd like to be a guest on My First Ride podcast. I'm Gary Neidert, and you've just experienced My First Ride podcast. Call me 972-771-7899 or send me an email, myfirstridepodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching.